I used to joke that my best friend's house felt more like home than my own. Maybe it was because his family actually sat down together for dinner, or because the walls held a kind of warmth my apartment never could. Most nights, after long study sessions or lazy evenings that stretched too late, I ended up on their couch or in the small guest room down the hall. It wasn't planned. It just happened often enough that it became part of the rhythm of my life. His father was always there in the background. At first, he was just that background, a tall figure in the kitchen frying something on the stove, or a low voice offering me a polite goodnight as he retreated to his room. He carried himself with a certain gravity, like someone who didn't need to demand attention because it naturally gathered around him. I thought of him as intimidating, though I couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the way his eyes seemed to see more than I said, or the calm, measured way he spoke, as if nothing could rattle him. In the beginning, I barely registered him beyond that. He was my friend's dad. After all, he wasn't meant to be someone I thought about. But over time, small things started to press against my awareness. I remember one night when I'd been bent over textbooks for hours. My friend had given up and gone to bed, leaving me in the living room with papers spread everywhere. His father passed through, pausing just long enough to set a mug down beside me. Steam curled upward, carrying the rich smell of coffee. "You'll fall asleep on those notes if you're not careful," he said, his voice low but not unkind. I hadn't told him I liked my coffee black, no sugar, no cream, but that's how he'd made it. Another evening, when I dragged myself in the kitchen after a long day, he was already there, sleeves rolled up, chopping onions with the kind of steady ease that made the act seem meditative. He looked up, caught my eye, and without asking, set aside an extra plate. It was the simplest thing, but it anchored me in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't just the gestures. It was the silences, too. Most adults I knew filled quiet with idle chatter, but not him. When I sat in the living room and he was reading the newspaper across from me, the stillness didn't feel heavy. It felt safe, somehow, like being near him was enough. Even without words, I started noticing his hand, too, the way it would rest briefly on my shoulder when he passed behind me. Just a fleeting touch, firm, steady, unthinking, probably. Yet every time, it lingered longer in my mind than it should have. There was one night in particular I can't forget. My friend had fallen asleep early, leaving the two of us in the living room. A muted lamp threw golden light across the room, shadows stretching long across the walls. He was sitting in his chair, a book open in his hands, while I scrolled absently through my phone on the couch. I don't even remember what pulled my eyes to him. Maybe the sound of a page turning, maybe nothing at all. But when I looked up, I found his gaze already on me. It wasn't sharp or questioning. It was soft, unreadable, as though he'd been watching me for a while. For a moment, I froze, caught in the weight of it. He didn't look away, and I couldn't either. The silence stretched, not awkward but charged with something I couldn't name. Eventually, he gave a small nod, almost like a good night, and lowered his eyes back to the page. But I sat there restless, the glow of the lamp painting everything in a quiet intimacy that clung to me long after I'd gone to bed. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the guest room, trying to explain to myself why a simple glance had left my chest tight and my thoughts impossibly tangled. I told myself it was nothing, just a look, just a silence, just my imagination. And yet, in that space between us, something had already begun to stir. The storm rolled in quickly that evening, the kind that seemed to swallow the sky in one sweep. By the time I got back to my friend's house, I was half soaked, my shirt clinging to me uncomfortably. My friend had already left for the night, muttering something earlier about meeting someone in town. That left me standing in the entryway, dripping water onto the tile, when his father appeared. "You'll catch a cold like that," he said, his eyes scanning me in that calm, assessing way he always did. Before I could respond, he disappeared down the hall and returned with a folded shirt in hand. "Here, dry clothes first." I hesitated, but he raised an eyebrow, and the quiet authority in that small gesture was enough to make me take it. I mumbled a thank you and slipped into the bathroom to change. The shirt was loose on me, the fabric soft, smelling faintly of his cologne, Woody, clean, subtle. I told myself not to notice, not to think about it, but each breath carried it deeper. When I caught my reflection in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. I looked like I belonged to him in some small, secret way, and the thought left me unsteady. By the time I emerged, the storm had cut the power. The house was swallowed by darkness, except for the faint glow of candles he'd already lit. One sat flickering on the coffee table, casting his face in soft shadows. He glanced up as I entered, his gaze briefly resting on the shirt before returning to my eyes. "Better," he said simply, and something in my chest tightened. We sat in the living room, the storm outside rattling the windows. The usual hum of appliances was gone, leaving only the sound of rain and distant thunder. I tried to focus on casual conversation. Classes, work, anything mundane, but each word seemed to carry more weight than it should have. He listened closely, responding with quiet observations, and yet beneath it all was a silence neither of us addressed. At some point, I shifted on the couch, and he moved to sit beside me instead of across the room. It was nothing practical, really, sharing the light of the candle. But the space between us narrowed until I could feel the warmth of him, his shoulder nearly brushing mine. I became acutely aware of everything. The way his arm rested casually along the back of the couch, the faint creak of leather as he leaned back, the soft cadence of his breathing. My own breath felt uneven, too loud in my chest. I stared at the flame, pretending to study its dance, but all I could think of was how close he was. The conversation faltered, then slipped away entirely. What replaced it was silence, thick and stretching, but not uncomfortable. It was something else, something charged. I could sense his presence without looking, feel the weight of his eyes flickering toward me, then away. I dared a glance, and for a second, our eyes met in the glow of the candle. His expression was unreadable, calm, steady, but his gaze lingered longer than it should have. I felt heat crawl up the back of my neck, and I looked away quickly, my heart hammering. Neither of us spoke. We sat there as the storm raged outside, a strange stillness binding us inside. My shoulders shifted slightly, almost brushing his. I told myself it was accidental, that I hadn't meant it, but I didn't move away. Neither did he. The silence grew heavier, wrapping around us like a secret. I wondered if he could hear how hard my pulse was beating, if he felt the same strange current tugging between us. Then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the power returned. The lamps blinked on, flooding the room with brightness that felt too sharp, too ordinary. I blinked, disoriented, and pulled back slightly as though caught doing something I shouldn't. He exhaled softly, leaning forward to extinguish the candle with a quick breath. The flame died, leaving only the steady hum of electricity, filling the room again. Nothing had happened. We hadn't touched, hadn't spoken the thoughts crowding the air between us. And yet, as I excused myself for the night, I knew something had shifted. The shirt still clung to my skin, carrying his scent, and my mind replayed the silence, the nearness, the weight of what wasn't said. When I laid down in the guest room, the storm fading into the distance, I closed my eyes and realized that everything felt different now. I didn't know what it meant. I only knew that it couldn't be undone. I told myself I'd leave early that night, before anything could twist itself into more than it already was. The storm had passed. The house was quiet, and my friend wouldn't be back until later. I gathered my things, my books, my phone charger, the damp shoes I'd left by the door, and moved quickly, like leaving fast enough to outrun the thoughts that had been following me all evening. He was there, though, as I slipped through the living room toward the front door. Sitting in his chair, a lamp casting pale light across his shoulders, book in hand, though I doubted he was reading it. He looked up as I passed, his eyes catching mine for just an instant before I forced myself to keep walking. Heading out. His voice was even, but something in it made me pause. "Yeah," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Early class tomorrow." I reached the doorknob, but before I could turn it, his hand was on my arm. It wasn't forceful, barely more than a touch, really, but it stopped me all the same. His fingers rested just above my elbow, steady and warm, and every thought I tried to bury rose sharply to the surface. I froze. My whole body went still, like the air itself had thickened. When I turned, His eyes were already on mine. They weren't questioning, not searching, but holding me with a kind of intensity one didn't know how to meet. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was the smallest gesture, nothing anyone else would have noticed. But standing there with his hand on my arm, I felt as though he had said everything without speaking a single word. Then, as gently as he placed it there, he let go. "Good night," he said quietly and stepped back. I nodded, though my throat was too tight for words, and slipped into the hallway. My hands trembled as I set my bag down in the guest room, my pulse still drumming in my ears. The spot where his fingers had rested felt impossibly alive, like heat pressed beneath my skin. I tried to settle into bed, pulling the blanket over me, forcing myself to stare at the ceiling. But the silence of the house was different now. Thicker, every creak of the floorboard a reminder that he was somewhere down the hall. I heard his footsteps once, slow and deliberate, the wood groaning faintly under his weight. They stopped just outside my door. My breath caught. For a long moment, nothing happened. No knock, no word, just his presence, a pause that stretched until it was unbearable. My chest ached with the pull of it. The fear that he might open the door, the sharper fear that he wouldn't. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the sound moved on. His steps receded into the distance, leaving me alone in the dark. I pressed my hands over my face, restless, every nerve alive with something I didn't know how to name. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the way he looked at me, felt the weight of his hand on my arm, heard the silence outside my door. Something had shifted, quietly but irrevocably. I knew it wasn't just me. And that knowing, that terrifying, impossible knowing, kept me awake until the first hint of dawn crept through the blinds, washing the room in pale light that felt more like confession than comfort. It was late again when it happened, the kind of late where the house fell into a hush so complete that even the clock ticking in the hall seemed too loud. My friend was gone for the weekend, and though I'd told myself I wouldn't linger, I ended up staying after dinner, wandering into the kitchen for water I didn't really need. He was already there, leaning against the counter, sleeves rolled up, a glass in his hand. The overhead light cast his face in muted gold, highlighting the faint lines near his eyes, the kind of lines you only notice when someone had smiled often in their life, or learned how to hide when they weren't. "You're still awake?" he said. I nodded, setting my empty glass on the counter, though I hadn't even filled it yet. "Couldn't sleep?" He studied me for a moment before answering. "Neither could I." The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but heavy in a way I'd come to recognize. Something always lived in those pauses with him. Tonight, though, it felt different, sharper, like it was pushing us both towards something we'd avoided for too long. "You ever feel," I began, my voice sounding too small, "like you're supposed to know where your life is headed by now, but you don't?" His gaze softened, and he set his glass aside. More often than I'd admit. I looked at him then, really looked. He didn't appear uncertain. He always carried himself with such steadiness. But there was a flicker of weariness in his eyes, something unguarded. "Your age," he said slowly, "is full of questions. My age is full of answers you don't want to hear." He gave a quiet laugh, almost bitter. Or maybe it's just full of loneliness, if I'm being honest. That word, loneliness, hung between us. It rang through me in a way I couldn't ignore, because I felt it too, even if I was too young to admit aloud most days. I leaned against the opposite counter, arms crossed to still the tremor in my hands. "It doesn't suit you," I said before I could stop myself. He tilted his head. "What doesn't?" "Loneliness." The word felt dangerous leaving my mouth, but I didn't take it back. His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable, and for a moment I wondered if I had gone too far. But instead of pulling away, he asked, very quietly, "Do you ever think of me?" It wasn't the kind of question someone could answer with a joke. It wasn't even really a question. It was a door, cracked open just enough for me to see what was waiting inside. My chest tightened. Every instinct told me to step back, to laugh, to say something light and easy, but the truth sat heavy in my throat, impossible to swallow. "Yes," I whispered. The air seemed to shift around us, thick and charged. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. He straightened slightly, his shoulders tense, as though the ground had just shifted beneath him too. I didn't move. I couldn't. My eyes stayed locked on his, the silence stretching until my heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. Then he leaned in, not enough to close the space, not enough to demand anything, but just enough that I felt the pull of him, the possibility. His breath brushed mine, warm and steady, waiting. I should have been terrified, and I was, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't fear of him, or even of what it meant. It was fear of how much I wanted it. So I closed the distance. The kiss was tentative, trembling at first, as though we both weren't sure if it was allowed. His lips were warm, steady against mine, and the world seemed to fall quiet around us, like even a house was holding its breath. He didn't rush. He didn't push. He just let it happen, let it unfold slowly, until my hands were gripping the edge of the counter for balance, and my chest felt like it might break open. When we finally pulled apart, it wasn't with haste, but with a kind of reverence. His forehead rested lightly against mine, his breath uneven. "This is," he began, then stopped, as though the words couldn't quite catch up to what just happened. "I know," I murmured, my voice barely audible. And I did know, even if I couldn't name it. Terrifying, beautiful, impossible, necessary, all of it at once. We stood there for a long moment, the quiet wrapping around us like something fragile and holy. Neither of us moved to break it, because we both knew nothing would ever be the same again. That night, I didn't go to bed right away. I stayed in the kitchen with him, sitting side by side at the table, not speaking much, just existing in the same space, the air still humming with what had happened. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I wasn't restless. I was simply alive, every nerve awake, every breath heavy with a truth I could no longer deny. The house felt softer somehow, like the air itself had shifted after what had just happened in the kitchen. My lips still tingled, as if the memory of his kiss was etched into them, unwilling to fade. I couldn't stop replaying it. How tentative it had been, how it carried both hesitation and a weight of longing that had clearly been waiting like mine beneath the surface for too long. We ended up in the living room, without really deciding to. Neither of us said much. Words felt too sharp, too inadequate for what we were carrying. He sat first, leaning back against the couch with a sigh, and I followed, curling into the corner, trying not to tremble. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't the kind that pressed down and demanded escape. It was lighter, fragile in a way, as though any sudden move could break the fragile thread connecting us. After a few minutes, he shifted, resting his arm across the back of the couch. It was a casual motion, but it pulled me closer, just enough that my shoulder brushed against his. The contact was small, almost accidental, yet it rooted me to the moment. I let my head tilt slightly, testing, as if my body wanted to know if his presence would really stay. When my hair brushed his shirt sleeve, he didn't move away. Instead, I heard the faintest sound, a breath, deep and steady, that told me he was as aware of it as I was. I laughed softly, surprising even myself. "This feels strange," I admitted, my voice low, almost swallowed by the quiet. His lips curved into the kind of smile that carried years of patience and restraint. "Strange," he echoed, "but not wrong." I looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time I allowed myself to see him not as my best friend's father, not as a distant figure in the corner of the room, but as a man, flawed, complicated, lonely, and warm. And sitting here, so close, he wasn't unreachable. He wasn't some untouchable figure at all. He was just him. The realization made me smile, though it trembled. "I don't even know what this is," I whispered. "You don't have to," he said gently. "Not tonight." Those words settled over me like a blanket. For so long I'd been searching for clarity, about school, about life, about myself. But for once, uncertainty didn't feel terrifying. With him, it felt like permission. We drifted into small talk after that, though neither of us seemed particularly invested in the details. He asked about my classes, about how late I'd been up the past week, teasing lightly about the fact that I never seemed to sleep enough. I teased back about his cooking, how I always looked forward to dinners at the house. The ease between us was startling, as though kissing had simply unmasked what had already been there, waiting. At one point, I laughed at something he said, and my hand brushed his without thinking. His fingers twitched, then stilled, and for a long moment I debated pulling away. But I didn't. I let my hand stay close enough to feel his warmth, though not quite interlaced. It was almost more intimate that way, the suggestion rather than the act itself. "You know," he said after a pause, "I never thought I'd feel this again." His tone was quiet, unguarded in a way I'd never heard before. I looked up at him, heart thudding. "Feel what?" His eyes softened, and though he didn't say it directly, the meaning wrapped around me anyway. Connection, desire, affection, things that had no name when they hung between us, but felt undeniable nonetheless. I swallowed, not sure if my voice would even hold. I never thought I'd feel this period. That made him chuckle, low and warm, and the sound spread through me like heat. He didn't push further, didn't ask for promises or definitions. We just sat there, letting the night carry us. Eventually, I leaned my head against his shoulder. The decision was quiet, natural, as though my body had been waiting for this exact moment. He didn't move, just shifted slightly so I'd be more comfortable. I could hear the steady beat of his heart beneath his shirt, and for a long time I simply let myself exist there, breathing, listening, feeling. The world outside the walls of that house no longer seemed to matter. There were no labels, no rules, no questions waiting to be answered. There was only the rise and fall of his chest beside me, the warmth of his arm resting along the back of the couch, the quiet rhythm we had stumbled into. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, speaking only in fragments, little jokes, soft murmurs, confessions that carried no weight. The awkwardness that should have been there was instead replaced by comfort, a sense of belonging I hadn't expected. It was surreal, fragile, yet so real it left me aching with both fear and wonder. At some point, his hand shifted, resting lightly on the edge of my shoulder. It wasn't a claim, wasn't a demand, just a quiet acknowledgement, a silent reassurance that this wasn't fleeting, that he was there, that we were there. And though I knew the fear would come back, the questions, the impossibility of explaining any of this to anyone, for that night, it didn't matter. The pull between us was stronger than the fear, and for the first time, I let myself lean into it. I closed my eyes, smiling against the fabric of his shirt, and breathed him in. For once, I didn't need to know where we were going. The first thing I noticed was the light. Morning slipped into the thin curtains, golden and quiet, casting soft shapes across the guest room walls. For a moment, I lay still, letting the warmth of it wash over me, grounding me in something real. And then the second thing reached me. The faint clatter of dishes, the steady hum of movement from the kitchen, and the unmistakable smell of fresh coffee drifting through the air. It felt surreal. For a heartbeat, I wondered if I had dreamed it all. The tension, the kiss, the quiet way we had fit into each other's presence on the couch. But no dream could conjure the warmth lingering in my chest, or the way my lips still remembered the shape of his. Something had shifted, and I knew it the way I knew my own breath. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the floor, and padded down the hallway. The house was hushed, only the faint clinking of a spoon against ceramic breaking the stillness. When I turned the corner into the kitchen, he was there, standing by the counter, shirt sleeves rolled up, pouring steaming coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up at me then, and the smile that spread across his face wasn't the polite, practiced one I had seen 100 times before. It was softer, unguarded, carrying with it something private, as though it was meant only for me. "Morning," he said, his voice low, easy. "Morning." I replied, though the word caught in my throat, waited with more than just a greeting. He set a mug down on the table before me, the rich aroma curling upward. His hand lingered as he slid it toward me, and when my fingers reached out to take it, they brushed his. The contact was brief, almost nothing, and yet, this time, neither of us pulled away. His thumb grazed the side of my hand before he let go, and it was the simplest gesture, but it sent a shiver straight through me. I lowered myself into the chair, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the mug, needing something solid to hold. He moved across from me, sitting down with a quiet exhale, as though just being near me was enough to release a weight he had carried. We didn't rush to fill the silence. It stretched between us, but not the way it once had, not heavy, not uncertain. It was comfortable now, threaded with a quiet acknowledgement of what had already changed. "Sleep all right?" he asked after a moment, his eyes steady on mine. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. Eventually, his answering smile was soft, knowing. Me too. We sipped our coffee in tandem, the steam curling between us like something fragile and new. I tried to memorize everything. The way the morning light touched his face, the lines that deepened when he smiled, the warmth that seemed to radiate from him without effort. For years I had walked into this kitchen, sat at this very table, and felt like an outsider looking in. But that morning, for first time, I felt like I belonged. We talked in fragments, about the weather, about the day ahead, about nothing that really mattered, and yet every glance, every brush of our hands when we reached for the sugar or the spoon carried the weight of something unspoken, something real. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, watching me with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "You know," he said slowly, "I don't think I expected any of this." I swallowed, feeling the truth of it settle between us. "Me neither." His lips curved, a trace of amusement there, but behind it was something deeper, steadier. He didn't press, didn't demand we define it or wrap it neatly in words. He simply let it be, as though acknowledging that what had begun didn't need labels to exist. The sunlight shifted across the floor, the quiet rhythm of the house, continuing as though nothing had changed. But everything had. I realized then that love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or thunderous declarations. Sometimes it slips in quietly, in the brush of a hand, the warmth of a smile, the comfort of sitting across from someone who sees you, really sees you. As I sat there, coffee warm in my hands, his presence steady beside me, I knew there was no going back. He wasn't just my best friend's father anymore. He wasn't just a quiet man in the corner of the living room, or the figure who lingered at the edges of my life. Somewhere between the silence, the storm, and the morning light, he had become something far more. He had become my forever.